I'm really happy to have you here, Tara, and thank you so much for making the time to speak. I know you are one of the busiest people I know in the cannabis industry, so I really appreciate the time.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk to everyone. And gosh, I don't know anyone these days who isn't busy, right? We're very good at keeping ourselves busy.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah,
They
but
say
thank you. Yeah.
that's the Buddhist monks would say the issue of the West is that they're too busy. So too much to do. But hey, at least it's somewhat bidding. It's a bit better than being bored, I believe. But um, nonetheless, I'm really interested to chat about New Zealand because I see this as one of the, even though it's a small market, there's so much potential in the way that this space is evolving, both on the medical and on the adult use side of the cannabis space. Um, I guess to start the dialogue, I'd love to get an understanding from your perspective as to just a general overview of where New Zealand's at right now from a medical perspective. What can you give us an overview of the regulations and how the medical framework works in New Zealand?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So without getting into too much of the detail, and I'm happy to take any questions after or go one-on-one in a contact. So one of the roles I took in supporting the Ministry of Health over the last few years was I was an advisor to the medicinal cannabis. I was a member of the Medicinal Cannabis Advisory Group to the Ministry of Health. So in that role, we had a multidisciplinary approach. There were clinicians, toxicology experts, cultivators, patient advocates, and myself representing clinical. So we had multi-disciplines giving inputs to the Ministry of Health on what we felt would be a reasonable approach to product regulation for cannabis as a medicinal product. So it's been years of work. We had to push through a lot of legislation because it became a charge of it became a political one of the Green Party in the coalition with the Labour Party at the last election. Their initiative was to really push getting access at an affordable price of quality products and an affordable price to those patients in New Zealand that really need it, who wanted access. So rather than facilitating a black market and use of the green fairies, the government felt very strongly about making sure that legislation was workable on the legal side of the fence rather than driven underground. So the legislation here in New Zealand, we were very restricted on time. We were given a year to roll out this legislation. So what and the Ministry of Health, in fair credit to them, they decided to focus on product quality and take a lessons learned approach from other major regions in the world, and understanding what worked and what didn't work in those other major regions that had been dealing in cannabis for 20 plus years, in the medicinal space, obviously. So the history of the legislation here and what we've landed on is pharmaceutical product quality grade material. And we look to educating the prescribers, nurse practitioners, GPs, and specialists. We look to leaning in on the literature that's publicly available and the emerging research that's becoming available. So it's really up to the prescribers to feel comfortable prescribing, and as part of that sector, when we look outside the regulations, we want to provide that support to the prescribing to the prescriber so that they have the essential information they need to feel comfortable prescribing these products. They're very unique. They're botanicals. They're not your traditional pharmaceutical drug products that prescribers would be used to writing a script for. These are new products, so there is a learning curve. It's not insurmountable, but it does require quite a bit of effort and education given to prescribers so that they actually feel like they can go on a journey with their patients. So we couldn't focus in on non-clinical and clinical testing like you would traditionally do for a pharmaceutical drug product. The 12-month period that I was involved in the advisory group was focused in, okay, how do we get an affordable product of high quality, pharmaceutical grade quality into and ready to use for New Zealanders. So that's how that's the history. To get to operate in the sector as commercial, there is what we call the medicinal cannabis licensing scheme, and that came about. It came into effect April 1st of this year. So within that framework, there's very prescriptive approach to meeting the minimum quality standard. I'm sure anyone who's in the New Zealand sector will know what that is, or anyone keen to get into the New Zealand sector, then I would suggest you go to the Ministry of Health website, and there's quite a lot of information there. So make sure you're ready to read, because a lot of the information is there, and they also have access to emails if you have any questions specifically about the licensing, or I'm happy to field any questions around that process. But that's the framework, depending on what your operation is. If you're in cultivation, if you are a seed merchant, if you want to actually do GMP manufacturing, if you want to do finished product packing, labeling and packaging, there's different levels, activities within the medicinal cannabis license scheme that you can apply for, and it all depends on what your commercial strategy is and what it is you're trying to achieve. So again, I would encourage you to link into some of the experts here in New Zealand who can give you some advice. It just depends on where you're coming from, and probably too little time to go into any of the details now. But there is, quite a prescriptive approach.
Well, what I'm interested to understand is, right now New Zealand's it's quite complex, because it's built on a model around importation as the primary avenue for product supply, like initially Australia was built. Now that there's been a number of cultivators and manufacturers established, Australia is starting to rely on its own supply sources. That doesn't mean that importation isn't readily available. The majority of products in Australia are imported. The New Zealand registration process to bring products in, can you briefly talk about how a company would import a product into New Zealand? And then I'm going to ask you a couple of details around what will happen in the future once those products are registered versus once companies in New Zealand are producing products locally. But can you talk a little bit about the importation process for products coming into New Zealand?
Okay. So in the New Zealand regulatory framework, we have a definition of what a CBD product is. And the definition, whether or not your product meets that definition, will determine what your risk profile is. And your risk profile, depending on if it contains a higher level of THC, will determine additional controls which will require additional licenses for you to obtain if you want to bring in finished products. So for example, taking risk profile off a pharmaceutical drug product, which this is, the definition here in New Zealand, if your product contains greater than 2% THC weight per volume, not total volume in the bottle, but weight per volume, that your product will require an additional, not just a medicinal cannabis license, with the activity is called a supply activity to import finished products, but it would also require that you look into getting a controlled drugs license, potentially. So this is all potentially, as well as an import license, and that would require, depending on the country, for the New Zealand Ministry of Health to issue a request for an import license in order for that exporting country to issue the license. And I know that can cause some delays, but the line is whether or not your product is low risk, or if it's that higher risk where it contains higher levels of THC. If your product is low risk, Adam, most likely all you're going to need, let's just say, for example, you're importing from Canada, for example. Your product, I would have to double check with the Ministry of Health. Well, I know that you'll require a medicinal cannabis license with a supply activity attached to your license. It'll be a general license and then a very specific license where a product assessment will be required. So there's a data package that has to be created around the products you want to submit. And that application gets submitted to the New Zealand Ministry of Health, the Medicinal Cannabis Agency, and that's evaluated. The timelines there are around 3 months they're expecting to be able to issue a medicinal cannabis license. So typically what I request is, because a lot of the information is coming out of a facility that is GMP compliant, it obviously has to be GMP compliant. I didn't touch on that yet. So the cornerstones of the medicinal cannabis license is that your product has to meet the European Pharmacopoeia specification.
Mm.
Okay, so that's the product, has to meet the specification. And also additionally, the product has to be manufactured in a GMP environment that has received accreditation from a New Zealand recognized member of PICS. And that's a group, a consortium of international regulators that do this mutual recognition based on the standards to which they audit and they operate. So you can be a member of PICS, but you may not necessarily be recognized by the New Zealand Ministry of Health.
That makes sense.
Okay, so Health Canada, for example, is recognized. We have a number of German recognized PICS auditors. We are, it's all outlined in a guideline. I'm happy to send that out to anyone, who the current PICS members are. So that accreditation has to be both for GMP manufacturing, and also the testing has to be done following the European Pharmacopoeia, and that test certificate has to be, all the testing has to be done in a GMP certified laboratory. Now, sometimes that's within the brick and mortar of the manufacturing facility, but there are times, for example, when you send out for pesticide testing to an outside laboratory, or maybe your microbial testing, yeasts and molds, bacteria, yeast and molds, you may also not want to do that in-house. So if you contract out some of your testing, that too has to be a GMP certified laboratory. So it is quite a complex, more robust, it's really modeled on pharmaceutical GMPs. And a lot of medicinal cannabis companies, international companies, are not ready for this. And I find that, talk about ramping up quickly, everyone's keen to get to this level of pharmaceutical grade, but it's getting there is a process, and especially with COVID-19, we can't get auditors into these countries to issue these certificates. So, on that point, if you do find a manufacturer and a testing laboratory that is GMP certified, and you realize that it's not recognized, it's not a PICS recognized member, you can request the Ministry of Health, New Zealand MedSafe, to go and audit, and you pay for those auditing services. But with COVID-19, they can't travel. So that's not an option right now. So when the borders open, that will certainly be an option. So we're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, because we have what we have in terms of PICS recognized members, and we also recognize that not all PICS members are equal, which is challenging and difficult, because if other European countries recognize them, why doesn't New Zealand? So we're working through all this with the Ministry of Health. It is challenging, and unfortunately COVID-19 doesn't help in terms of restriction of travel. So it is really important that customers understand that when you're doing your due diligence of prospective finished product partners internationally, that the product has to comply with the monograph, certificate of analysis that states compliance to the European monograph, and then those certificates of manufacturing and testing. And if you can get all that in, that's a really good start.
It's a good start.
Because after that, you have to actually compile a data package for the Ministry of Health. Because, either it's a product assessment, it's not, for anyone who's on the call that understands pharmaceutical drug GMPs and filing applications to regulatory bodies, there's a format called Common Technical Document Format, and that's one way of submitting the information, and it's a very logical for regulatory folks and regulatory reviewers to receive a data package from a manufacturing facility that's specific to how they manufacture, and it's a format that you present the data. So that's one approach that is acceptable to compile your data. A lot of the information that comes out of a manufacturing facility, it's proprietary, it's trade secrets. So you have to be able to partner with your manufacturer for them to be willing to create that data package, because a lot of it they won't want to disclose, right? Because it's potentially intellectual property that they will want to protect. So you have to find that relationship, that partnership, that are willing to share the information, assuming they have it, but they have to compile it and potentially submit it to MedSafe directly, and then they have to give a light version of that to you, so you can submit your product assessment also to the Ministry of Health. And then once both applications get to the Ministry of Health, there's a combined review done before they can actually issue you a license for that product. So it's not your typical medicinal cannabis application. I know, for example, TGA, they have a portal, upload information. It's a fairly, it's not as comprehensive, I think, as the New Zealand Ministry of Health. It's a different approach. So for better or worse, I mean, I know products are getting on the market, so that's a good sign. And so it is working. So we just have to wait and see. I do know there are some delays getting finished products to market. And again, the initiative around the medicinal cannabis scheme is to provide quality products at an affordable price, and keeping the cost down is, one of the big major remits for any medicinal cannabis finished product provider. They really want to make sure that the cost is affordable. So being able to negotiate that with a supplier as well is obviously a very important part. So as you can see, there's multiple multiple things to be thinking about as if you want to import finished products. And it's quite a high bar, but yeah, I do feel, if we wanted to talk about New Zealand legislation, I do feel like there's, this is the entry point. Adam, you and I have talked about this before. This is where New Zealand has landed. April 2020. As we get more familiar with these products, as more safety data and clinical efficacy data comes to light, there may be a will to start to de-risk some of these products. Maybe the products that have lower THC, there may be a political will to down-regulate. I know there's also an initiative with the Ministry of Health to reintroduce a natural products bill, which doesn't exist here in New Zealand. So maybe if there was a regulatory environment where we could down-regulate some of the lower risk products into a wellness space, like supplements, then we wouldn't have such rigor around these data packages. And then we just focus on the higher risk products, the ones that have the potential to have a psychotropic effect, which is really what the regulators are more concerned with, the more the clinical community are more concerned with. So I think there's room within our framework to improve, but we are where we are right now. It is working. It's definitely not perfect, but we are getting there in terms of at least it's a starting point.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, and I think that the approach that the regulators have taken is it's strict, but it's fair in the sense that, I look at the Australian landscape, and I mentioned this recently on a show that, we've got a somewhat of a dumping ground scenario because the TGO 93 compliance protocol, unfortunately, it only covers off a testing requirement, but it doesn't really dig into the quality aspects of the supply chain. So that leaves a lot of inherent risks because the material itself can be grown in particular environments. The processing of that material isn't referenced. The quality procedures for the manufacturer aren't there's no due diligence into those processes. So for all you know, your material can be coming from China. Not that there's anything wrong with that, because there's a lot of medicine that comes from China. But just as an instance, it can come from China. It can be processed in a broken down facility. And CanTrust is actually a very interesting example of this. So CanTrust, there was an issue a year ago where it was found out that CanTrust was illegally growing material in hidden areas. How do you decipher via TGO 93 testing what material came from the illegal aspect of that grow facility versus the legal? There's nothing. So the implementation of this scheme seems, although strict, it ensures the quality processes are adhered to, and that this is treated like a pharmaceutical, not as a pseudo-pharmaceutical, although it doesn't have the clinical reference data as a normal pharmaceutical, but there's these strict elements that need to be adhered to. So, I mean, we spoke about this last time on our discussion, that the merits of TGO 93 versus the European pharmacopoeia requirements versus the New Zealand quality standards. I think personally that the way that New Zealand's doing it is it's very fair. And it's going to ensure that the patients get the highest quality product. And the fact that the government's ensuring oversight over pricing helps mitigate the issue of overcost products. So I think that it's a good system. My concerns then kind of fall within the timeframes, because ultimately what my understanding is that the timeline was for October, that all product that was non-GMP needed to be removed off the shelves. But due to COVID, that doesn't seem like it's going to be a reality. So when do you actually see, I don't know how many products, if any at all, have been registered, but what do you see the timeline from your perspective, for products actually being available in market that meet the quality requirements of the New Zealand regulators? Do you have any kind of gut feel as to when we're going to see products that have fully gone through that process in market and available to patients?
You know, I don't really have visibility on that. That's really a Ministry of Health, but I do know that applications are being filed. And I do also know that, you know, because this is a new process and because there's so many what the New Zealand system would identify as non-compliant, because maybe when you test the product, it meets the European Pharmacopoeia, right? Because you can test at the very end, or pesticide testing, but when you don't have control over your process, and that's what they are drilling into, is we want to have control of our materials, control of our process, and therefore we have greater chance of controlling our finished product. It's taking the sector a little bit longer to come up to speed on pharmaceutical quality regulatory submissions, and I think, and the content and the data requirements. So that's what I find a lot of the time I'm working in is, okay, what is really needed versus what is nice to have, and then try to engage with the regulators on that front. And the reason why is that, so the Medicinal Cannabis Agency is a group within the Ministry of Health, within, I don't know if it's within MedSafe. I think it actually sits outside. I actually don't know. I'd have to confirm that. But anyway, it's part of the Ministry of Health. And what happens when an application comes in, to the best of my understanding, is that it gets triaged to reviewers who would typically be reviewers for pharmaceutical drug products. So they're looking for that rigor and that system approach to review of product quality. And when you don't have, you know, if you have, let's just say, for example, we have a product that's being sold in Australia and it's registered on the ARTG, or no, they don't get registered, do they?
No, they only if they're being exported, but it doesn't get registered if it comes in under TGO 93.
Yeah. So they're saying, I think there's a website where you have all your manufacturers and distributors listed, and you can contact them. Yeah. So I've seen it there. But all that's required is, you know, applying on that portal and submitting the data to state that your product complies. So what happens here, though, we're going off that, you know, we assume that as well, that your product will comply, but we have to drill, the reviewers have to drill all the way down into that manufacturing, that due diligence, that rigor around control of raw materials, control of environment, you know, your GMP status. So it's at that culture of quality that's being introduced into the medicinal cannabis sector that's actually quite new worldwide. I know the Germans are very rigorous, because it's the European Pharmacopoeia and it's GMPs, and so there are other countries doing what we're doing. And I'm really pleased that New Zealand has landed here, because ultimately what I see for the cannabis sector 10 years, when we crystal ball this, there will be patients who are going to want to see clinical research. And if we can conduct clinical research on GMP product, we remove that variable of product, you know, of product not being compliant, or not being, you know, there's if you can't control your material during clinical research, you're opening up another variable, whether or not your product is safe or efficacious. But if you control your product, that's the whole idea of supplying GMP material for clinical research. We've already taken it to that step. So we're already actually testing and evaluating compliant material, and then we send it out for clinical evaluation. And I think that's going to be the future, because there are going to be people, this is really nice to know that we've got anecdotal information, especially around, again, the higher risk products that may have, you know, the perception is that they can cause psychotropic effects, that not everyone should be, you know, engaging in high THC products. I think that type of clinical research is really the way of the future for these products. We have to understand minimally the pharmacology. How are these products behaving in our system? You know, what's happening metabolically? How much of it are we absorbing? How much are we excreting? You know, we're building that data set, no doubt about it, but it's not, and I'm not saying we need to do it at the level of pharmaceutical grade research, but I think there is going to be a portion of the population who may never want to take another chemical again, and they may think that, is this botanical really as wonderful as we think it is? Let's show me the data. you know. And I think that's where this medicinal cannabis sector is going to go, and we're going to be able to have product that's reproducible, that we know what it is, we know it can consistently meet a specification, where we run it at, you know, during this process at these settings for this timeline. We've removed any variability within reason into our process, so we know exactly what we're getting at is consistent all the time. And I think if the regulators and the end users feel comfortable with that, well, you know, the future for clinical research is wide open, and a tremendous opportunity to support the medical community, really. I think because a lot of them are saying, yeah, I know I need to read the literature, and I can, you know, apply principles from, you know, from reading the literature, which a lot of, you know, research physicians will do, or general practitioners or specialists. But sometimes it's really nice, you know, they're accustomed to prescribing with having a patient leaflet. You know? For those practitioners that are you know, would really want to lean in on clinical research on that product formulation, they don't have that. So it's I suppose, what's your comfort level as a prescriber? How comfortable are you just prescribing on literature references rather than an actual script on that particular product? So again, it's a complex issue because it's such a new medicine, and I think we really do have to partner with the prescribing community as well, and really listen to what they're saying. I think personally, that's you know, that's my personal view. I don't think everyone will agree with that, but that's where I would like to see the medicinal cannabis sector go. I'd love to see this research being done, good quality research on products that are consistently meeting GMP. We know exactly what's in there. We know the terpene profiles. You know, we understand, you know, there's, you know, with various combinations of acids, you know, and terpenes, you know, what are the potential health benefits here? You know, what are we seeing with this particular profile? So anyway, I think personally that's where I would like to see these products go, so they do get the credibility that I feel they deserve, or at least we should, as a society, we should use best endeavors to try to, you know, eventually once we set up manufacturing and we start feeling comfortable in there, but it's in the future. I can understand why companies don't want to do it now. You know, it's dollars and cents, isn't it? It's not, we don't have to do it, so why should we? But eventually, I think it's going to be the way of the future, where we're going to actually want to know exactly how this formulation works.
It's like in Brazil. It's the same. You know, there's a 5-year grace period before clinical trials need to be fully implemented for products that are available. I mean, there's so many degrees of complication in that specificity piece. I think Bedrocan have done a really good job of systemizing their processes so that they've got a consistent product. That's where I anticipate the industry will move in the direction. It's not there yet because it's not required, but you know, there will be a time where the product will need to be registered. It needs to maintain a consistent profile. Perhaps businesses will look at, because I spoke with a researcher recently her name's Hinanit. She was saying that from the research that she's been conducting in Israel, and Dedi Miri from the Technion, they both concluded that in each formulation that they're testing, there's typically 2 to 3 compounds that are the active compounds versus the minor cannabinoids and terpenoids. So that level of research, the industry is not caught up yet, but that's where I see it going as well. So having these systems implemented like they're doing in New Zealand to ensure the quality aspect of the industry is covered is essential. And then the research needs to catch up. But I think, there's only so many hours in the day that you're able to kind of build on these processes. So the manufacturers will need to focus on quality. The suppliers will need to focus on clinical research. And then, you know, they'll be able to meet in the middle. I mean, I know certainly for MediPharm, the focus is on the quality systems. The focus is on ensuring GMP manufacturing is adhered to in Australia and Canada, which they've done. And now it's about entering these markets, which takes the months and months of due diligence to put together these dossiers for submission. It's a complex process, and I guess that leads me into my next question, which is around, you know, what are the current challenges that are being faced by companies that are looking to register products in New Zealand? Has there been any pushback from regulators? What are some of the things that are arising from a challenge perspective?
I think, I suppose, speaking personally, I think it's, you know, you find just culturally, haven't come across a lot of the paradigm for those that are entering into the sector. You know, they're very entrepreneurial. You know, most do not have a regulated, pharmaceutical regulated background. You know, they're used to maybe operating in other regulated environments, but as we've identified here is that, you know, pharmaceutical regulation is very, very strict, you know, and it's very prescriptive, and it's different. So I think some of the challenges are, you know, creating that experience for everyone to understand what is, when a regulator says X, they mean X. It's not, you know, an interpretation, your interpretation of X based on your experience. You know, a lot of it's bringing along, educating and bringing people along. My background is regulatory. I mean, I'm a chemist in training, and I've worked in pharmaceutical, medical device, biotechnology. You know, it's sort of, you know, been very much part of my professional life, you know, for forever. If you're coming in from a different sector, which a lot of entrepreneurs are, because they see medicinal cannabis or they see cannabis and, oh, this is really cool, I just want to jump in, because that's their instinct, right? Because they want to get on this, and they don't have, now they don't have the experience, but of course they can learn it. So I think there's a learning curve there. There's some of the challenges, I think, from a sector perspective, is when you're dealing with a policymaker, you know, the Ministry of Health or a regulator, and when they say something, what they're saying to you is X, it's not something else. So you might need a translator. That's what I find sometimes. I find that that's been my role. For me, it's instinct, and I feel that I have to, you know, either explain that, no, this is what they really want, or try to negotiate the, you know, the regulator down. You know, do we really need to do that? You know, maybe we can do that later. You know, it's kind of that conduit between what's absolutely necessary, and talking the reviewers down as well a little bit. If for example, because the medicinal cannabis sector is so new, we're all learning, you know, really what is a true risk versus what is a perceived risk. So yeah, I mean, you know, some of the challenges. I mean, when I think about the regulation itself, Adam, would that be?
Yeah, I mean, because well, I mean, it's interesting, and I'm going to pause that question to ask the following, which is, have the regulators, because you are right, they're dealing with entrepreneurs who are very, you know, negotiation savvy. Have the regulators been, in any instances, willing to change their position based on logical, rational positions that are taken by these companies? So, you know, the example with stability studies, having the 3 batches required versus, you know, negotiating to commit to specific batches to fast track registration. Are the regulators starting to shift their perspective on the dialogue and change their position, or is it a hard and fast, no, the registration package is the registration package, we don't compromise? I think that, you know, from the experiences in Australia, there's been a lot of negotiation. So how is it the same situation in New Zealand?
I think so. I think the regulators are realizing the challenges, and again, they want to give everyone the opportunity to actually deliver a compliant product. I am in some discussions around the 3 batches. So we haven't landed on a final decision yet, but I can understand their perspective, you know, because that is a pharmaceutical ICH compliance requirement. I still think there is room for negotiation, and I think when you look at the stability section, and this is why I go back to that common technical document, there are very specific subsections where one of them is actually a commitment to quality, where you as the manufacturer will make a commitment to quality, that if, you know, you have products on stability, you'll be testing at the agreed upon intervals per ICH guidelines. And in the event that any of the data points fall out of specification, you will pull those products. So there's that commitment. So these are some of the conversations I've been having around, okay, we don't have 3 consecutive batches, this is too new a sector. And the question is, okay, show us your plan. What is your plan? Do you have a timeline? So we haven't landed on a definitive answer yet, but they are open to discussion and they understand the challenges. So I can't really answer specifically, but they are, you know, they do understand the challenges, and they aren't hard and fast, but they are listening. And but I also feel that we will eventually have to get to 3 stability batches. and, those batches can be sold for commercial use. There's nothing stopping you from doing that, right? So it's up to the manufacturer to get those samples on stability.
Yep.
And to pull, to be able to sell part of it. Obviously you're going to have certain part of it, make a large enough batch so you can actually, clean off some of the however much you need for stability. I think the bracketing approach to stability works really well. So not every size will have to be submitted. That you could do, from the smallest volume with the lowest headspace to the largest volume with the biggest headspace, for example, in your fill volume, if that's what it is, whatever your packaging configurations. There are strategies. There's some very experienced pharmaceutical quality folks out there that know how to do this for pharmaceutical drugs. So you have to tap into that knowledge and that experience. So, they're not expecting to have everyone on 3 stability batches straight away, but I think there's I believe there's an expectation that eventually you will have to get there if you want to sell that range of products in New Zealand.
And I mean, I completely appreciate that they are taking the approach of working with companies, because ultimately, you're right. If they were to adhere to the strict standards that they've put in place initially without having some compromise, then there won't be any products on market anytime soon. But what are the mistakes that you're seeing companies making? So we talked about challenges, but are there any kind of common issues that you're seeing that companies are, apart from the entrepreneurial mindset with a lack of pharmaceutical knowledge, what are some of the kind of common mistakes that businesses are making that are trying to bring products into market?
Stability is a great one. Saying, we don't need to do it. I think the best thing you can do is just start your stability program and give an update. We've got 1 batch on stability. These are the time points. This is when we'll be pulling it out of stability, out of the chambers. This is when we think we'll have our 12-month dating. Just open up the conversation. Instead, they decide that it's a better position to just argue and debate and justify why it's okay not to have 3 batches. I think if you have a commitment to stability, there's a better chance, and you give regular updates. I think that's a really good way. You keep that engagement going with the regulators, with your reviewers, saying that you'll update them on your stability program throughout, as soon as you get data points coming off. I think it's, taking a step back. I mean, that's just an example. I think one of the big mistakes companies aren't doing is that they think regulatory can just be done, anyone can do it, and there is an approach. There is especially when you're dealing with medicine reviewers as well. I mean, there's regulatory protocol, and entrepreneurs coming in saying, we'll just do it our way, and that doesn't always work. I mean, I think the regulators are very patient, but in the end, it's just their resources. At the New Zealand Ministry of Health, they're a small team. They're really pushing through a lot of data, a lot of applications every year, thousands on the medicine side, and a very, very small team. So, you have to be respectful of their time. So my strategy is, it may take longer to prepare your file going in, but once it gets in to the regulator, it's going to get through, because you've got as complete a submission as possible. That's always my strategy. Identify upfront what the data requirements are, just gather the information, put it into a format that a medicines reviewer is going to understand, for example, CTD, or if CTD doesn't apply, put it into the format that a medicinal cannabis license, their templates that they offer you. But no, it's not just completing a form. It's the form is almost an attachment. You have to tell your story. I think the cover letter is critical, because if you explain yourself in your cover letter and you give an update, look, this is who we are, this is what we're doing, this is our facility, these are our plans, these are the products we want to bring in, this is where we are in our compliance. You tell your story. A lot of the time, regulatory, just if you're wondering what regulatory is, you're storytelling. You're storytelling, and you're telling your story from the perspective of how your business and how your products meet the regulations. And by using someone like myself, or someone who has history with regulators, an experienced regulatory consultant, they can help you. They can help tell your story. For me, when I work with my clients, is give me something to work with, bullet points, tell me your story, and I just love working with startups. I love that entrepreneurial spirit. I mean, they're just great. I mean, it's just so much. It's so much fun, And what I do then is I take all their points and I create a narrative and I push it back to them and say, okay, what's wrong with this? I start creating narrative because I don't know their whole story, and then they come back and they edit it. That's the process. And then I'll finalize it after that. And then I'll say, okay, this is what we're going in with, have a quick last review, and this is what we're going in at. I think some companies are making the mistake of maybe not trusting their regulatory consultants to know what's best and rushing to get in. If there's an expression, I worked in the States for a long time, garbage in, garbage out. If you put in a low quality submission that's not complete, you're going to have multiple rounds of review. But if you put in by the reviewers, and they're going to keep kicking it back, and you're not going to be able to advance it in the process. But if you put in a high quality submission, you lay it out following a format that they understand, with content that they're expecting based on ICH guidelines, based on PICS compliance guidelines. So you speak the language, a regulatory reviewer's language. They start looking at this, oh gosh, this is great. I can follow this. I'm not trying to figure out where my attachments are, or what was she saying again? And, I mean, there's a way of doing this. It's regulatory affairs. It's a profession. It's not just something you can learn it. Absolutely, you can learn it, but it takes time. So I would really encourage, if you're really, there are, MediPharma, you got your regulatory group, you know what they're doing. I mean, they're pretty.
They work hard.
Yeah.
It's intense. It's very intense.
And it's very.
And it's very. There's a lot of, not only the due diligence of inspecting the groups that you work with, but putting together the documents. I mean, it takes months and months and months.
And that is totally underestimated. So can you imagine adding that on to entrepreneurs that know nothing about pharmaceutical regulation, that don't know it yet? They're learning, and they're so open, and they're so great to work with. But imagine trying to teach that. You can't teach that until they have a first experience. And I find that sort of, it's just repetitive. And this is not the first time I deal in medical devices as well. It's the same thing. New CEOs, they don't know what's, a regulatory strategy is, what the benefit is, and then you lay it all out. So it's that learning curve of entrepreneurs coming into a heavily regulated environment. Don't underestimate the amount of time it takes for that information to get across to the business, so that they can plan resources, plan timelines, plan communications to their investors. It's not just sort of tossing something over the fence and hoping for the best, right? You actually want to have a planned approach to your regulatory submission. You want to understand what the risks are of going in with an incomplete submission and make that choice. The business ultimately makes that choice, whether we go in now with limited information or we go in with a complete submission and wait another couple of weeks. Yeah, it's 2 weeks later, but maybe that'll get us through the system quicker. In my experience, the more complete your submission is, the easier the review cycle, and the reviewers inside they have such a different experience, and they want to engage with you. They want to give you your license, because you get on the good pile, and they love going to that pile. And it's just that emotional kind of experience they have when they say, oh, thank God, this is an easy one, rather than dealing with ones that are incomplete, or they're still waiting on information and they keep revisiting it. And I know the reviewers, they give, I think what they're doing, what I've understood is they're giving 2 rounds of review. They do an administrative review, they request information. You have the opportunity to give that information, and it has to be complete. And then if you send in that information, it's not complete, they'll give you one other chance to do it. And if it's still incomplete, they'll just kick the whole thing back to you and just say, look, whenever you let us know when you're ready. That's what I'm understanding. But again, I can't speak for the review process, but that's what I understand is happening. So just think of it when they see a complete submission coming in with a cover letter, that the cover letter could be 10 pages long and with attachments and everything, but you're telling your story, and I always like to put navigation tools like PDFs, like all these little tricks, you write in a Word template, it's got a style template applied. So when you distill it to a PDF, those hyperlinks come across automatically. So when you click on a link, it's taking you to the attachments. All these little tricks that helps the reviewer get through it, rather than bearing through, trying to do a word search for Appendix 1, for example. So you make it easy for them. You make it so easy that they're going to want to go to your application. That's
a great set of insights. I mean, the reality is these aren't things that you'd necessarily think about. So no. My understanding is, you put in your dossier, I think it's module 3 that their requirement is. So you put in your module 3, and it's just a comprehensive document, but there's the simplicity of making a good user experience. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily think about that for the regulators. It's for me, it's a very pharmaceutical, if you will, approach. Very, very plain, very structured, but not not navigationally friendly. So you're saying that the best thing that you would advise companies is to ensure that the registration package itself is user friendly, making it easy to navigate through that documentation so that the regulators can find exactly what they need when they need it, as opposed to having to kind of go through the search process.
Oh, totally. I mean, that to me is inherent in my profession. I've been at this now for 26, 27 years, and this is one of the first things you learn as an entry-level regulatory affairs specialist. All you do is publish documents. All you're doing is handling data. So, firstly, I don't want you to think it's. Firstly, you have to have all the technical content there, right? So there's the creation of the authorship, all that tech. So you have requirements to meet, and you need to address each one of those requirements, and you need to actually be able to write the technical data sets. You need to present tables and limits and specifications and referring constantly back into standards and guidelines. So there's a way of writing, right? So you have to have the technical content, but once you have the technical content and you get your authors to either write in templates that you give them, or you get them to give you the bullet points and I do the authoring, that's another way of doing it, right? And I have my templates. Only then you start that publishing piece, which makes it easy, because then obviously the content, I'm making the assumption that the content is sound. You can't just send in a very light content. They won't approve that, but make sure you got two pieces. Make it a good experience, but make sure the content is 100% meeting the requirements of the scheme, the regulatory scheme.
So earlier,
yeah,
but earlier you mentioned that there's for companies that are in New Zealand. I mean, MediPharm, for example, publicly available. They're working with Cannasouth. So there's two submissions. There's the MediPharm submission, as an example, and then there's the Cannasouth submission. Can you just talk about these two different submissions for a moment and what the differences are?
Yeah, I'll speak in general terms. So typically in this particular instance, as is available in the public domain, that MediPharm is supplying Cannasouth with finished product. So MediPharm has secured in its supply chain, it has secured compliant products. So really, some of the challenges, because this is a deal, right? So the deal between the supplier and the distributor or the owner of that particular finished product, whoever it is, in New Zealand will have to apply for a license in New Zealand. But since MediPharm isn't actually applying to distribute product in New Zealand, they go through, because a lot of their information from their suppliers, their manufacturing suppliers, is proprietary, confidential. I mean, the amount of work that goes into validating a manufacturing process, as I'm sure you know from working with MediPharm, is significant and a significant cost. So what's required under the medicinal cannabis license, there are very specific questions that the reviewers have asked around that. For example, manufacturing process and CPP's critical process parameters and CQA's critical quality attributes. This is all, process validation and quality target product profile terminology. It's all about designing a product and designing a system so that you consistently deliver the same product. So this is all pharmaceutical product quality regulation that all happens in the background of when you're purchasing a pharmaceutical product. So I can imagine, MediPharm, as they have invested in significant resources in delivering this product to market, they don't necessarily want other potential parties to know those trade secrets. So the opportunity there, as we mentioned, is that a file, MediPharm can submit a file directly to the Ministry of Health. And that will contain all that confidential information. So what if we were distributing here in New Zealand, if I decided I wanted to distribute product here in New Zealand, or anyone, you mentioned Cannasouth, they have they would go through a medicinal cannabis license application. And with that, under the existing scheme, there are 4 different types of activities depending on what your commercial objectives are. So, for example, there's cultivation. That would be one activity you could apply for if you're a cultivation arm. If you want to manufacture, you have to go under a possess to manufacture license activity. If you're a seed merchant, you have to go for a nursery license. What else? So these finished products, if you want to import, it's called a supply activity. just speaking in very general terms.
Yeah, that's fine.
So they're the different, so the requirements are different, you know, at the supply activity, while the Ministry of Health are asking for all this information, you're, as a MediPharm, as a supplier, as a holder of all that, won't potentially feel comfortable sharing that proprietary information. So there's, you know, you can send in a very heavy version, very detailed version into the Ministry of Health, whereas anyone that wanted to sell your products here under just the supply activity, it would be sort of a lighter version of that application. And they would share whatever they feel comfortable with. And all of this would be agreed up front, of course, between the businesses. And then we present that to the Ministry of Health. And so far, so good in my experience. It's called a drug master file. That's one way of doing it. A DMF. That's what we call it on the pharmaceutical side. And what I've done in the past is I just modify that. Not all the elements of the CTD are required. You know, they don't really require a lot on design and development, but they are very interested in manufacturing controls, manufacturing process, and quality control testing, as you know, and having control over your I suppose your impurity profile is really important. They want to make sure that, you know, testing for pesticides has been done. They want to make sure that there's no untoward effects going to be extracted or elements extracted out of these products that could potentially cause health issues. And it's, you know, it all goes back to risk management, doesn't it? I mean, quality risk management, that's where we're at, and pharmaceutical quality risk management. So yeah, so that's the approach. It would be a different file that would be submitted. But if you were a vertically integrated medicinal cannabis provider where you're cultivating and then you pass your material on into a GMP environment here in New Zealand, and then you do your final fill and finish, you would be applying for multiple activities, all under the one license if you want to.
Yeah, that sounds, that would be much more complicated. So sending out the API and having it finished in New Zealand, would that be more complicated than just sending the finished product?
Yeah, because if you were processing here in New Zealand, so if you decided to send source API and you wanted to do your GMP processing here in New Zealand, the site here in New Zealand would need to have their manufacturer medicines license under the Medicines Act. They would also have to have a possess to manufacture license so that they can actually hold that active, depending on whether it's a high THC product. They would have a controlled drugs license potentially. Yeah, and an import license if they were importing it from overseas. So there's multiple licenses. And then what else would they need? They have to go through some sort of product assessment, supply activity. So yeah, it can get quite complex, but it would all be under one medicinal cannabis license with various activities. As I understand it, it's still new. I mean, we're still learning as we go. So don't quote me on any of this, but that's been my recent experience, you know. And it's we're all learning. I mean, you know, I'm learning, the regulators are learning, and everyone's just been really great. It's a really neat sector to work in, I have to say.
Yeah,
everyone's very, you know, we just want to get this done. We want to do it right, and you know, I really respect that. You know, it's good to see the ethics are there, and the value, you know, that we're seeing this as, you know, we haven't really talked about we've talked about medicinal and the health benefits and how, you know, we don't want to cause any harm, right? So how we control that here in New Zealand through assuring product quality and compliance to minimal quality standards. So that's our risk reduction in the absence of requiring clinical trial data sets or non-clinical work to be done. So, you know, it's all about risk reduction. You know, we talk about the cannabis referendum is coming up, and, you know, I really don't have a strong opinion either way because it is a political issue. But you know, it's not really about creating a new business. It's all about risk reduction and trying to, in my view anyway, we want to reduce harm, you know, to New Zealanders. Because right now, if you want to engage in, it's an illicit activity, right? And we can't assure product quality. So I think people are going to do it anyway. So wouldn't it be nice to give them products that are clean?
Yeah,
we know what's in them, you know. So but I think that's really important. It's all about managing risk and protecting New Zealand public health. And that's really why I wanted to be an active player in the sector, you know. And I feel that the skills I've learned over the years in pharmaceutical and just product regulation in general have really sort of served me. It's a nice sort of transition period to being able to apply principles to a very entrepreneurial, you know, new sector and an exciting sector. You know, a lot of fun. I like it. I like it a lot.
You and I both, Tara.
Yeah,
You and I both. Well, I guess we've just hit an hour, so
Yep.
I won't keep you any longer. I did want to speak about the recreational or the adult use market, but again, I think it'd be better to broach that once the referendum has actually occurred. So I'll earmark that, or I'll put a flag in the ground and say, let's pause for now and broach the conversation in the future once that's implemented, because I'd love to understand the full mechanisms of how that scheme works. But let's leave it for another conversation.
Lovely, lovely. Thank you very much, Adam. And
my pleasure, Tara. That's it. I really appreciate your time and how thorough you are with your thinking around the implementation and implications of this scheme, and how we need to keep it strictly medical in the sense of professionalism, for quality, for ethics, for standardization. I really appreciate the way that you see this. So thank you. And I love your work, and I look forward to continue working with you both on a professional level and getting to know you personally, because it's been a delight.
Yeah, likewise. And if anyone on the call has any questions, just, feel free to share my contact information, Adam. And, I'm here to help. I really want to put that out there, that just to facilitate getting these products on the market is, really something I feel very passionate about, and getting quality products so that New Zealanders have access to, a reasonably priced and actually, have that health benefit come along with it. So, right now, some of these products are really expensive, and we need to bring that price down and have the quality there too. So I'm here to help. If anyone has any questions, just please reach out anytime.
Thank you, Tara. Take care of yourself.
Very welcome. Have a great day. You too. Thank you for everybody.
All the
Thanks.
best.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye. Bye.